Welcome back to Python Tooltips. In this episode, we're going to create a button in Python using PyGame. I trust that you've already prepared the screen and game loop as always, as this video is just about how to create a button. If you haven't, please stop the video real quick and copy this code from the screen, or head over to the video about how to create a screen in PyGame. Once that is done, we can begin. What we're going to do is we'll create a button that, if pressed, will carry out whatever we tell it to do. And we'll create it in a way that it indicates that it's clickable when we hover over it. And we'll also make it show when it's being pressed, and we'll make it play a sound when it's being pressed. So let's start. The first thing we're going to do is to create the button itself. To do that, let's create a button class. This will make it easier in the future to create several buttons without having to type out the code for every single button. So we create our class button and give it an init method to tell Python what's supposed to happen upon creation of an object of that class. And upon creation, the user is supposed to give it an image and an x and y coordinate. Then, we're going to tell Python that the button is supposed to have a width and a height, corresponding to the image width and height, which we get with the getWidth and getHeight method. Next, we're going to tell Python which scale the image is supposed to have by using pygame.transform.scale and giving it the image and the width and height, which we just defined. Then, we're telling Python to basically draw a rectangle around our image, using basically the natural rectangle around the image, by using the getRect method. And in the next row, we're telling Python that the top left corner of that image is supposed to have the x and y coordinate the user is going to give it, so that that's the point where Python is supposed to start drawing the image. And then we're going to define a variable clicked and set it to false. We're going to need that in the next step. Once that is done and our init method is complete, we're going to need a second method, the display method, to basically tell Python to display the button to the screen. For this method, we're going to tell the user that they have to input a surface on which the button is supposed to be displayed. And then in the method, we're creating a variable position, giving it the position of the mouse, and create a variable clickIt, which we're also going to need in a second. In the next step, we're going to tell the method to blit, so to display the image of the button to the screen. So we're using the surface, which the user is giving to the method, using the blit method, giving it the image the user gave it in the init method, and giving it the x and y coordinate of the rectangle, which we also defined in the init method. So once the display method is now called, the image of the button is going to be displayed to the surface the user is giving to Python. But we also want to make our button clickable. So we're going to use an if statement to check if the mouse position, which we saved in position, is colliding with the rectangle of the image. So basically we check whether the mouse is hovering over our image. And in the next step, we're going to check if, while the mouse button is hovering over our image, it's being pressed. And if it's being pressed, we're going to set the variable clickIt to true and the variable self-click to true. And since we now checked whether our image is being clicked, we also want to check whether the mouse button is being released. So in the next if statement, we're checking whether the mouse button is being released and if that's the case, we set click to false. So basically that we can click the button again. And once we have that, we're going to return click it. If the button is being clicked, we're returning true, and if the button has not been clicked, we're returning false. And that's it. That's basically our button class. Now that we have the button class, we're going to want to make an object out of that class. And for that object, we're going to need an image. So let's create a variable button image and preload the image for the button in it. So we create the variable button image and set it to pygame.image.load. And within the parentheses, we're giving it the path of our image. In my case, I'm using an image called button.png, which lies in a folder called images, which lies in a folder one level above the file we're currently working in. And once we have the file path, we're going to say .convert alpha to tell Python that this image is supposed to have a transparent background. Perfect. Now that we have the image, we're going to go beneath the class button and create an object out of that class. So we're going to create an object button and make it a child of the class button, give it the image button image, which we just defined and preloaded, and give it an x and y coordinate, in this case 200 and 150. Perfect. Now we have our button object. But to show it now, we first need to go into our game loop and call the display method of the button object. So let's go into our game loop and call the button by saying button.display and give it a surface, in our case screen. And if we run the program now, there is our button. But for now the button is only an image. To make it clickable, we have to go back in our code and make an if statement out of the button. If button.display screen do something. This doesn't tell Python that if the button is displayed, it's supposed to do something, but it's basically referring to the variable we returned. So we're saying if the clickIt variable of the display method of the button is true, then do something. Or in other words, if the button is being clicked, do something. So to make it visible that the button now actually does something when it's being clicked, let's make a count out of it. Let's create a text image of a number, and let's increase that number every time we click the button. So first, we're going to create an image by using the blit method on the screen and giving it an image, in that case our text, and an x and y coordinate. So we're saying screen as our surface, .blit to use the blit method, and use pygame.font.sysfont give it a font and a text size, to make an image out of our text. And then we say render that text. And the text is supposed to be whatever we save in the variable number. And then we give it 000 as our text color, which in this case is black, and give it an x and y coordinate, in our case 350. So this complicated looking line basically just tells Python, make a text out of whatever I save under the variable number and save it as an image and put it on the screen. So the next thing we're going to want to do is to create the variable number to tell Python what it's supposed to display. So we're going up here and create a variable number and set it to 0. And now we're going back to our button, delete the pass, and instead tell Python, every time you click the button, set number to number plus 1. And if we now run the code and we click our button, every time we click the button, the number increases by 1. So by now, we actually have a functioning button. What we now want to do is to indicate when we hover over the button that it can be clicked. Because sometimes you have a screen full of different stuff and you want to indicate to the user what can be clicked and what not. So we want to give an indication when the mouse is being hovering over the button. To do that, we basically just want to tell Python, if we hover over the button, give it another image. So we first go back where we loaded our image in. And create a new variable, button hover image, and give it our hover image to preload. And once the image is preloaded, we go back into our game loop and tell Python that if our mouse cursor is colliding with our image rectangle, and the mouse is not getting pressed, so if we really just hover over it and don't press the mouse, then display the hover image for the button instead of the normal button image. Otherwise, if we don't hover over the image, display the normal button image. And if we try that now, you can see that every time I hover over the button, it changes the image. So we now have a functioning button that does something when we click it, and that gets a different image if we hover over it. So in the next step, we also want to have another image if we press the button, so that the user has a visual indication that he currently is pressing the button. So once more, we're heading back to our images, create a variable button pressed image, and preload our pressed button image. And once we have done that, we go back in our game loop. And while we currently say, if we hover over the button image, so if the mouse cursor has the same position as our image rectangle, we now want to say that if that is the case, and we press the mouse button, show a different image. So if we just hover over the image and not press the button, show us the hover image. But if I hover over the image and press the button, show the pressed button image. And if I don't do any of those, so if I don't press the button and do not hover over the button, just show the normal button image. So we're going to insert an elif between the if and the else statement. Perfect. And if we try that now, you can see that we still have our button, we still have a change when we hover over the button, and now that we press the button, we see a different image. And if we stop pressing the button, we see our old button, or the hover over, depending on where you release the mouse button. If you release the mouse button over the button, you're still hovering over it and see the hover image. If you release it outside of the button, you're not hovering over it, so you see the normal button image. Perfect. Now we have a button that does something if we click it. We have a visual indicator that we clicked it, and we have a visual indicator that we're hovering over it. The last thing we want to add now is to make the button play a sound when we press it. To achieve that, we're going to need to go back into our button class. We're going back to our display method, and while we currently give the display method a surface on which the button is supposed to be displayed, we now also want to give it a sound effect. And then we go into our display method, and we tell Python that we want to create a variable sound and want to preload the sound that's supposed to be played once we click the button. And then we go into the part where we check whether we are clicking the button and tell Python that if the button is clicked, play the sound. And last but not least, we have to go back to our game loop, go to where we called the button and the display method of the button, and give it the sound effect we wanted to play. And that's it. If we try that now, we can see that we still have our button. We still get an image when we hover over it, and if we click it now, we don't just get a new image, but we also get a sound effect. And that's it. That's how you create a button in Python using PyGame with a hover over image, a pressed image, a functionality, and a sound. See you next time for more tooltips in Python.